So to conclude this chapter, let's revisit the Americas just to keep pace with the book a little bit. So here is the digital topographic map of North America showing two possible early migration routes into North America. The coastal migration route, well, the color is missing here, the red, and the Clovis first route in yellow. So here is the Clovis first route, which goes into the interior, taking this ice-free route between the two glaciers, as you can see, and then spreads into the interior, whereas the coastal route argues that the migration route happened on the western side of the glaciers, which, because of maritime weather, presumably would have been ice-free. The terrain and bathymetry inset map show Queen Charlotte Islands region off the coast of British Columbia, Canada, as it appears today, and as it likely appeared around 13,500 years ago after the last glacial maximum. Okay, lowered eustatic sea level combined with a forebulge that developed when ice loaded the mainland formed a coastal plain that linked the islands to the mainland. This land bridge probably facilitated the migration of plants, animals, and humans between the mainland and the islands. So when the glacier grows and gets really thick, the land gets pushed down and the land ahead of it gets pushed up. So this land would have been pushed down and this would have been pushed up after the melting of the glacier. This is sinking and this is rising. So sea level rise here now is a combination of warming of the oceans as well as sinking of the land. But coming back to the last glacial maximum, that would have created some kind of a route here according to this coastal route hypothesis. So you can see the summary here, Cordilleran ice sheet. So the freezing of the Bering Strait, Beringia would have given a land bridge from Asia, Russia and China, and ice-free corridor opened by at least 13 kilo years here for the interior Clovis route, or there is a argued coastal migration as well. And there are many evidences going back to a long time ago where Chinese artifacts have been found in many places here, which is used to argue all sorts of things. But you can go back to as far back as 13 kilo years here, Hablor. So these are all the evidences 14 to 15 kilo years ago, Cooper's Ferry 16 to 15 kilo years, the Pulsley Caves 14 to 13 kilo years ago, and going south here, 5 sites at Plowey, Santa Elna, Monteverde, and so on. So in general, it's assumed that somehow populating of the Americas must have happened through here, because there is no evidence that people came directly across the ocean. Okay, this is another one talking about populating the continent. Here you are talking about Beringian land coverage, 1 kilo a year. This is Yana RHS. So hypothetical scenario for the peopling of the Americas showing possible migration events A to E, as described in the main text of this paper in Nature, colored according to putative region of origin, Beringia, Siberia. So you have Siberia here, Beringia here. Also shown are some key archaeological sites in North America and Siberia, and the type of evidence: genomic, mitochondrial DNA, Y chromosome DNA, and archaeological. So you know that mitochondrial DNA is good for tracing lineage backwards, whereas Y chromosome DNA gives you more haplogroups and so on, in terms of where the relation, how these populations are related to populations elsewhere, and so on. Okay, so I won't go too much into the details, but you can see the various dates, some known, some unknown, basically reinforcing what we said here. So leaving that there, populating of America has become much more understood more recently, and the times at which it got populated have been pushed back now into the glacial period, the last glacial period. But conclude the chapter with these main points. There exist a number of key environmental factors that have influenced hominin dispersal. Mountains, rivers, deserts, glaciers, and glacial lakes can act as geographic barriers, which can also become bottlenecks for genetic limitations from one population to the one that is moving out. Lowered sea level can generate expansive coastal plains rich in resources during glacial intervals. So a lot of vegetation and megafauna and other resources can become available. Hominin dispersal was likely influenced by climate change and faunal and floral dispersal associated with shifts in terrestrial biogeography like coastal plains rich in resources. Such dispersals would have required less behavioral and potential morphological adjustment than would have hominin dispersals beyond accustomed habitats. So this is claiming something that we have to think a bit more about, because we have said it's not clear whether behavioral changes are related to brain changes or genetic changes. And morphological adjustments basically like developmental evolution, not necessarily genetic evolution. So we are debating here again what we discussed before about adaptation versus adaptability, genetic adaptation to different climates versus anatomical and behavioral evolutions. Faunal and potentially hominin dispersal in Eurasia was probably from south to north and from east to west during warm interglacial intervals, and from north to south during cold glacial intervals. So there was dispersal back and forth that has to be remembered. This movement potentially resulted in greater population dispersal during warm intervals than cold intervals, when populations likely concentrated in glacial refugia and warmer southern regions. So when glacials or cold stadials come, the places where they can live get squeezed in, so then people get concentrated, whereas when it's warm and more areas open up, there is more dispersal of hominins. Genetic exchange between populations probably increased during glacial intervals because of the concentrations, when populations likely congregated in productive refugia, and especially when land bridges linked regions unconnected during intervals of higher sea levels. So especially in Asia, going from Africa into India, into Southeast Asia, Indonesia, maybe even Australia, and across into Europe, these land bridges would have helped, and concentrations would have allowed more genetic exchanges. The genetic makeup of separate populations is probably the result of genetic drift, inbreeding, genetic bottlenecks, and geographical isolation. So we talked about this a little bit as to how genetic drift and bottlenecking can happen. A particular genotype is not necessarily more adapted to a particular environment than any other, with some exceptions relating to physiology. So those that could deal better with cold climates, like Neanderthals, had structures or skin morphologies, not morphologies, hair structures, skins, and so on, which would give them an advantage. On the other hand, social intercourse that results from migration and communication and consequent interbreeding combine to make a whole greater than the sum of its parts and provide potential for behavioral and technical innovation. So definitely there was interbreeding between Neanderthals and sapiens, and maybe also the others that were there, like Erectus habilis. We don't know about Floresiensis, Devonians, and so on. Considering how long they coexisted it's possible that a lot of genetic mix happened. Physiological change or behavioral change, particularly migration or dispersal, is a more reasonable response to rapid climate change than slow gradual genetic change associated with natural selection. As stated in Pease et al., migration may often be more important than selection in allowing a population to respond to changing environmental conditions. So when quick abrupt climate changes happen, populations may just migrate to newer situations than to wait and be wait to be selected naturally based on their genetic adaptation and so on. Individuals living in regions where the quality of resources is patchy, for example in high latitude regions, are more likely to disperse over greater distances and be somewhat less affected by barriers to migration. Further, species occupying large territories frequently exhibit migratory behavior and exhibit high levels of gene flow. Okay, so this is combining intuitive ideas with genetic evidences. Freshwater was likely a key influencing factor in hominins' ability to adapt to particular locations and in dispersal routes taken. The location of freshwater and the level of precipitation would have changed through time in response to a changing climate. So depending on how far back you go, monsoon was already in place during the time scales we are talking about, mostly during the Pliocene, Pleistocene. So let's say from 3 million to the more recent times, to the end of last glaciation, let's say 10,000 years ago. Of course, more of the colonizing of Micronesia, Polynesia happened even during the Holocene, but nonetheless rainfall variations over those times obviously would have affected particular locations and ability to adapt to particular locations and in the dispersal routes taken. Okay, so obviously I have been very succinct in summarizing this very long chapter, but I hope you get some idea of the multiple species, multiple migrations, multiple dispersals, and interactions with climate, interactions with each other, and the uncertainties in interpreting all these things, especially things like populating the Americas and the late arrival of our species in Europe, especially compared to the Far East. How did they go that far east and not occupy Europe? Obviously, Mobius line is one of the theoretical, hypothetical explanations, but this is an evolving topic. So if I find good papers coming out, I will keep putting podcasts in a section called New Findings, but for now I will leave this here and we'll go to more specifically climate events that have shaped potentially the human evolution in the last couple of 100,000 years. Okay.